welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Morantz-Cohen, and today I'm pleased to welcome back Dana Gioia for the second part of our two-part interview. Dana Gioia is chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts and a noted poet and literary and cultural critic in his own right. In the first part of our interview, we focused on our guest leadership of the NEA. In this second part, we'll talk about his own poetry and his view of the state of poetry and of literature in general. Dana Gioia, welcome back to the Drexel interview.
Good to be here.
Okay. You are a great proponent of memorizing and recitation of poetry aloud. And I wondered if you could begin our interview by reciting one of your own poems, since I know you are a poet as well as a critic.
Okay, well, let me recite a very short one.
Okay.
It's only 6 lines long.
Okay.
Although it began as a much longer poem, and I kept cutting it down and cutting it down and cutting it down. Actually, the Philadelphia Inquirer asked me for a poem about New Year's, Day, and I ended up, writing a poem. By the end of it, it had nothing to do with New Year's, so I had to write them another poem. And this is called Unsaid. And what it's really about is how much of the life that we lead is invisible to anybody but ourselves. Unsaid. So much of what we live goes on inside. The diaries of grief, the tongue-tied aches of unacknowledged love are no less real for having passed unsaid. What we conceal is always more than what we dare confide. Think of the letters that we write our dead.
It's beautiful and true.
Well, it's an odd and private poem in some ways, but I think it touches a chord in most people's lives. At least I hope it does.
Yeah, I think it's got a universal resonance. Now, it's interesting that you say it started out as a much longer poem, and then you condensed it.
Well, I started off as a 36-line poem about New Year's Day. And then after I wrote it, I began to cut it down to 32, to 28, to 24. A month later, it was at 20, to 16, to 12. And finally, when it was about 8 lines long, I realized it was far too long. And I cut it down to 6 lines. And then it was there, but it no longer had anything to do with New Year's.
So you wrote another poem for the choir.
And so what I discovered that about poems is that a poem has a kind of meaning it wants to have, and what the poet's job is to collaborate with language to let it take the course of imagination.
That's so true. I mean, as a fiction writer, I would say the same, that it takes on a life of its own, and you have to let it, you have to follow it.
Yes.
So I can see that would be true. I'm interested, though, in this whole process of condensation that happens. You often find that you pare down.
Yes, I do. I almost always cut my poems substantially. And I do it for 2 reasons. First of all, I'm an anthologist, and as I put together anthologies of great poems, the thing that is remarkable is how short most of them are.
Yeah.
And I realize that most contemporary poems are kind of long-winded, sort of sprawl a bit.
Yeah.
And secondly, I've discovered that a lot of times when you cut something out, you actually make the poem stronger.
Absolutely.
Because you make the reader have to lean a little bit more forward into it and to project their own life. In fact, I've come to think now that a great poem almost always leaves something essential out. And then the reader has to supply that from their own life experience. And part of that sort of projecting your own life into a poem is that particular excitement that we get from poetry.
Interesting. Now, that also sparks a thought in me. I know that you are very much a proponent of, I guess it's been called the new formalism, which is a return to form, which has been sort of maligned in recent years. That is to say, meter and even rhyme. And is there any connection there between what you just said about the way a poem draws you in and those aspects of
I think
poetry?
it's a big subject, but let me start off by saying that for me, poetry has primarily always been an auditory art. What a poet is a kind of enchantment. A poet creates a spell with the music of words, and that kind of hypnotic state that the music of poetry creates allows the reader to, first of all, bring down the defenses that we carry through every day of our lives that make ourselves more vulnerable And so in a sense, that enchantment heightens our attention and our retention of the message. And so it seems to me that that it's easier to do that, with rhythm and meter. And there's a lot of poems, I think, that sort of create that spell. Now, I also believe that we are living in a point in culture, and the very fact that we're having a literary show on television demonstrates my point, where our culture is an auditory culture again. People can read, but they get much of their information on the telephone, on TV, on radio, on iPods, et cetera, et cetera. And so the spoken language has a kind of dynamism and importance in our culture that it simply didn't have when T.S. Eliot was writing. In fact, I think our age is much closer to Shakespeare's age than it is to Eliot's age.
It's more performative.
Yeah, it's performative, it's verbal, vocal.
Well, you've written a book called Disappearing Ink and the Decline of Print Culture. Is that, I don't know if I got that quite right. But in it, you talk about the decline of print culture, and I assume in some part you bemoan that, but on the other hand, there are these tremendous movements that are going on in poetry in particular that are very performative. I'm thinking of rap and cowboy poetry and stand-up poetry and this sort of thing. What do you think of those movements?
Well, I mean, I would say that new formalism, which is in a sense literary poetry's equivalent of rap, of stand-up poetry, of hip-hop, in that it's a performative, vocal, auditory kind of poetry. And I mean, the interesting thing is that poetry is the best-selling category of recorded sound. We call it rap, but it outsells every other kind of recorded sound. People are hungry for poetry, and when the academic poets, the literary poets, aren't feeding that hunger, what you've seen in the last 25 years is that the people, as it were, invent new forms of poetry to feed that hunger. And so I think we have a generation of kids coming up right now because of their experience with rap, with poetry slams and things like this, have an extremely sophisticated and heightened sense of auditory language, words being shaped for literary effect in performance.
Yeah.
And I think that's good news for poetry.
Do you see that circling back to the print culture, or do you see the print culture essentially dead? I know you can't see that because you're sponsoring so much at the NEA that has to do with
a way
reading.
of thinking about it is that we're in a culture that's not about either or. It's not that print dies and spoken language rises. We're in a culture which is much more complicated. What we have, really for the first time in history, are 5 or 6 different kinds of technologies. Print is one, film is one, sound is one, that each of these, in a sense, does something slightly better than the other. Right now I'm reading War and Peace by Tolstoy. It's an incredible experience. You lose yourselves in the lives of these characters. That is a print experience. You cannot recreate that even with a TV mini-series, because you get inside the minds of people, and nothing does that so well as the novel or the short story. On the other hand, the interesting thing about poetry was created by society before print ever existed. It is primarily a verbal vocal art. And so in this odd sense, poetry finds itself very much at home in a secondary audio culture. That it's oral. It's not the fact that people can't read, but that people like to communicate as much through oral language.
Right, but that's one strand of poetry. There's also the highly intellectual element in poetry that, of course, would not translate well to performative expression.
It can and it can't. I mean,
say T.S. Eliot, as you had mentioned before.
But T.S. Eliot works awfully well when you say him out loud.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, think of it this way: Shakespeare never chose to publish his plays. They work beautifully on the page and they work beautifully in performance. So I think that a lot of poets like myself, we're writing both for the page, basically, and for performance. Not performance in terms of ranting and raving our brief hour upon the stage, but in terms of a kind of an oral reading of poetry.
Right.
And so I think that in a funny way, poetry is returning back to its historical norm. We're writing a kind of poetry that Donne and Milton and Dante would have understood.
Okay, yeah, I agree. I want to talk a little bit about your own background, which fascinates me.
It's a very odd background.
It's odd, and I'm just going to outline it briefly, and then I'm going to ask you some questions about what motivated you to go from place to place. Now, you started out, you attended a Catholic boys' school in California, high school, where I read that you were something of a cut-up, but still managed to be the valedictorian. Okay, you may want to explain that, but we can move on. Then Stanford University, where your interest was music, and you wanted to be a composer. You became interested in German and German poetry, and when you graduated from Stanford, you decided to go to graduate school at Harvard for a degree in Comp Lit.
Yeah.
And then from there, you then decided, for reasons that you can explain to us, to give up that course and go back to Stanford for an MBA. Now, I find this fascinating. It's a very circuitous course. You then went into business. You worked for 15 years at General Foods,
Yes.
where you rose to the position of vice president. You continued to publish poetry in the New Yorker and other places. Then you became head of the NEA. I'm interested in whether this route was, whether you were confused and upset as you were moving through these various changes, or if there was a method to it, and I guess secondarily, since I have a son in college who hasn't got a clue what he wants to do, whether you see this as a healthy kind of oscillating back and forth.
Well, actually, you've simplified my career, because between my business career and my NEA career, I was also a freelance writer for 12 years.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So it's, I was a bohemian. I went from business to bohemia to bureaucracy.
So after General Foods, you were working.
Yeah. Let me see if I can explain, put some method to my madness.
Okay.
I'm a working class Latin kid from LA. My dad's Italian, my mom's Mexican.
Okay.
I'm the first member of my family ever to go to college. And like a lot of people, I knew at a very early age I wanted to be an artist. But I had that kind of vague...
And how did you know that?
Because I would hear music and it would just ravish me, where everybody else sort of said, oh, that's nice. I'd read a book and it would just change my life, and everybody would say, oh, it's okay. And I mean, paintings, music, literature always just knocked me over, and I just wanted to have a life where I was near it. But I had no role models, growing up. I mean, nobody we knew. They were all craftsmen or carpenters or worked in plants. My dad was a chauffeur, then he was a cab driver, then he worked in a department store. My mom was an operator for Ma Bell. And so, the one art that I had early training in was music. And so I thought I wanted to be a musician and a composer, although I always liked poetry. And then when I went to Stanford, over the first couple of years of Stanford, I made the shift between music into poetry. And I knew by the time I was about 20 that I wanted to be a poet. But that raised a problem. How does a poet make a living? And my parents neglected to give me the private income I so richly deserved.
I see.
And so I figured I had to do it myself. So I figured, well, the only poets I've met are professors, so I'll go to graduate school. So I got a fellowship to Harvard, and I was in graduate school. I had wonderful teachers. I had Elizabeth Bishop, I had Northrop Frye, I had Robert Fitzgerald, the great translator of classics.
Now, were you studying literary theory and literature, or were you actually studying poetry?
Well, I was studying Comp Lit, which at that point was beginning to be literary theory.
Yes, yes.
And after a couple of years, I liked it. I was very good at it, but I said, two things are happening. They're training me to write poetry, literature, and write about literature in a way that the very people I came from can't understand. And secondly, I like this academic stuff, and I'm beginning to write stuff that's just too complicated, because I'm writing a poem to be interpreted rather than to register. And I figured I had to get out of academia, because it was, while I liked it, it wasn't good for me as a writer. So I quit, and I decided to go to business school. But I think I'm probably the only person in human history that went to Stanford Business School to be a poet.
Okay. And it did work out for you that way.
And I made myself a promise that I would write or read 3 hours every day. And so for the next 17 years, the 2 years in business school and the 15 years in business, I worked every day. And I began publishing, and I was really quite successful. And then I had a number of things happen in my life. The most significant one is my first son died in childhood. And I had a heightened sense of my own mortality, and I decided one day I was going to quit my job. So after 15 years at General Foods, I resigned, And for the next 12 years, I was a full-time writer. I wrote poetry, but I also wrote criticism. I became a music reviewer. I was one of the American commentators on the BBC.
So you made a living at
yes.
being a freelance writer,
So
which of course is a hard thing to do.
And so I did anthologies, wrote criticism, did radio, wrote poetry, began writing for music. I did 2 opera libretti and things like that. And I gradually became, really, quite successful at it and quite totally engaged in this. And then, I got drafted into the NEA, to run the public agency, which has been, the funny thing is I was always able to write while I was in business, but being chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, I work 7 days a week.
So you have not been able to write?
Tiny bit.
Well, it's interesting. I've read that you call yourself a contrarian. And I mean, if I look at your career, it looks like you're looking at what the established dogma is and you're not accepting it, or you're questioning it. And yet you have, at various junctures in your life, been in the establishment position as a vice president of a major corporation and now of a major government agency. And do you see any tension there or contradiction? And
I do think of myself as a contrarian very much. But when you're contrarian, it doesn't mean you disagree with everything.
Okay.
What it usually means is that you look at what people think is right, and you say, I agree with that, but not that. And so you take, in a sense, you pick your battles. You take something and you try to change it. I mean, for example, it seemed to me, now I write in form, but I also write in free verse.
Yeah.
Some of the poets that I've most championed, like Robinson Jeffers, Robert Zoller, who is a historian here at Drexel, is a great Robinson Jeffers scholar. And Jeffers wrote primarily in a kind of very controlled free verse. And I don't believe that a poet should write in free verse or meter. What I believe is that a poet should have the freedom to write in whatever form the poem suggests, from free to formal. But during the 70s, it was not allowed to write in form. You were attacked if you wrote in form, so that irked me. And
that's true at the writing programs, the major writing programs. It was looked askance at.
There were magazines that had as their official policy, you'd love this is a direct quote, no rhyme or pornography.
So they were more or less on the same level.
Yeah, and so it seemed to me that was a battle worth having.
Yeah.
I mean, and so what I'm trying to do is I've tried in a funny way to make American literature more inclusive, more diverse, by challenging some of the pieties. And that tends to rile some people.
Okay, well put. And I will say as a teacher that invariably students do like a poem with rhyme. They just like it.
Well, the thing is that, I mean, one of the odd things is when I was in graduate school, I was told that you shouldn't write in rhyme and meter because it was elitist and undemocratic.
Huh.
And I kind of said, well, gee, the average people I know actually like it more. It seems to me that it is not elitist and it's quite populist. But I think that, I think people love in art.
I think it's an archaic view. I mean, it's sort of Whitman was going against it, but we're now so much further along that it's taken on a different kind of political
Well, the funny
coloration.
thing is that what I couldn't see is that since all popular music is in rhyme, why is it? It seems to me it's actually more populist to write in rhyme rather than less elitist. I mean, and free verse poses certain technical challenges for the poet, as does formal verse. But for me, it's basically, I like to write in every possible style because each style has a certain effect that it gives you, and if you do it well, you can bring something off that's really quite sensational, I think.
Okay. I think that's eloquently expressed. And I guess this is sort of extending the same discussion. You wrote an essay in 1991 in the Atlantic Monthly magazine called Can Poetry Matter? And that did spark debate. Will you acknowledge that?
Yeah,
it was
absolutely.
Controversial, and it was, I mean, in a way, very good for poetry, I think.
That article generated more mail to the Atlantic Monthly than any article on any subject in the entire history of the magazine.
Is that true?
Now, the interesting thing, though, is that the responses fell into one of 3 categories: positive, negative, and incomprehensible. If you take though the positive people writing to support it were 6 or 7 to 1 versus the negatives. Now, most of the time when people write, they write to disagree with an article.
Sure.
So that surprised the editors.
So you struck a chord
Yeah,
there.
but the most interesting thing was that every negative letter, and there were hundreds of them, I mean, we're talking about cartloads of mail, every negative letter was from somebody who identified themselves as being in a creative writing department.
Oh.
And so, I struck a nerve, but I struck a nerve in creative writing departments. See, the gist of my article was really was quite simple, although I think I elaborated it in a rather subtle and complicated way. It was that we had a kind of paradox in American culture. Never in the history of humanity had so many people been paid to profess poetry. People that were teaching poetry, teaching creative writing. And yet, probably never in the history of humanity did we have a society in which poetry was valued less by the average educated citizen. And it seemed to me that maybe, just maybe, there was a connection between these two facts. And if you explored it, you began to see that there indeed was. And that bothered a lot of people.
Because there was a certain vested interest in writing for a closed circle?
Yeah, and actually, I think I don't think it's confined to poetry. I think
it's true of literary criticism, certainly, and even literature itself to some extent.
Well, I think one of the bad legacies of the 20th century is that we created all these intellectual subcultures in history, in literature, in science, in social sciences, where the people got very good at talking to each other, professional conferences, professional journals, and got worse and worse at talking to other people.
Right.
And so we have this situation in our society that I'm very concerned about, in which our intellectuals and our artists are kind of locked into subcultures, and the kind of intelligence and energy and imagination they have doesn't spill over into the rest of society enough. I think one of the necessary works of the 21st century is to reopen these broad conversations in our society and make parts of our society talk to one another that don't normally converse.
Yeah, and that has certainly, the notion of the public intellectual, do you think that we're moving back into that area? Who would you say constitutes our public intellectuals right now? Can you actually name someone?
I think we do have some public intellectuals. You can take people, I think a local Philadelphia girl, Camille Paglia, is a public intellectual.
She's been quiet lately.
And you can see people that are academics, like Harold Bloom doing this. When I left General Foods, I had a chance to go into academia, but I felt that my role was to be a public intellectual, to try to write without condescension for a mixed audience, to people that are basically, my audience is the intelligent, the alert, and the curious, wherever they find themselves in society. And it's interesting is when you address them, they're eager to listen. Somebody who's been really quite good at this has been Garrison Keillor. Garrison Keillor reads a poem every day on Writer's Almanac. Now, it's not a lot of poems, it's one poem. He doesn't have a poetry reading, he reads a single poem. And he gets, I think, 5-6 million people listening to that poem. And I think that's a kind of, it seems quite modest, but it's also quite visionary.
Could I interject here that our producer, Lynn Levin, is going to have Garrison Keillor read one of her poems?
Yeah, I heard that. I was so pleased for her.
Yeah, I'm very pleased for her too. So, but that's right.
Well, I'll give you an example. My sister paid her way through college. She's 20 years younger than me, in ROTC. She was on an aircraft carrier in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And this guy comes up to her and says, "Do you have a brother who's a poet?" And she says, "Yeah." He goes, "Oh, okay." And then about 10 minutes later, somebody else says, "You have a brother who's a poet?" And she goes, "Yeah." I says, "Oh, yeah, I heard a poem of his." And then about 5 minutes later, somebody says, you got a brother who's a poet?" And funny, she said, "Why are you people asking me this?" And they'd all, in the middle of the Indian Ocean, they'd heard Garrison Keillor read a poem of mine.
Had you known that he was reading? Oh.
No, but I'm just saying that's kind of wonderful reach. In the middle of the Indian Ocean on an aircraft carrier, you've got somebody reading a poem every day.
Right. But there aren't very many forums that have that reach, unfortunately, in this country.
Exactly, but that's why a show like yours is so important, I think, because what we're trying to do is to have a conversation that you would not normally hear on television.
Right.
And the kind of people that are doing radio in an ambitious way is very, very important. And as a poet, I don't want simply to reach other poets. I want to reach people across all walks of life, because I think that a broader audience I think calls more from the artist. I think one of the powers of Shakespeare is that Shakespeare had an audience that included the aristocrat and the stable boy.
Right.
You know, the intellectuals and the merchants. And he had to find a language and an imagination capacious enough to embrace all of their life experience.
Yeah. And on you know, sort of segueing from that, what about, I mean, you have, I think, had some thoughts about how we can get children to appreciate poetry and perhaps literature in general, but specifically poetry. And I wonder, because I think that's a great failure in some of our public schools now, teaching poetry on all levels, but particularly to children where the taste is so, children are so open to the possibility of wonder. What would be your advice to elementary school teachers, parents about that, teaching poetry to children, getting children interested?
I think it's a very good question. I mean, there's many ways of teaching poetry, and one of the problems is that we've made poetry basically texts that we use for analysis.
Yeah.
So they give you a poem and they say, what does it mean? And now that's a very interesting exercise, and I myself enjoy figuring out what a poem means, but that's not how someone comes into poetry. We've got to do two things, I think, with poetry. One is to reconnect it with the expectation of pleasure. Somehow poetry and pleasure have been disconnected. So if I say I'm going to read you a poem, you go, oh my God, stop. And then the second thing is you've got these kids and they've got tremendous performative energy.
Yeah.
You know, in fact, the rowdiest kind of, you know, fidgetiest kids in class, if you got them to memorize and recite a poem, suddenly they find that they're good at it.
And they could channel some of that energy.
And I found that as a teacher, sometimes your problem kid becomes a star when you bring performance, recitation into it. Because they like to show off, they want attention.
Right.
And sometimes they're not good at analysis. So once again, I think that you need to teach poetry in a greater variety of ways. And I would say, first is to just give people the experience of the pleasure of poetry. It's hearing marvelous, accessible poems read to them, probably by their teacher, by actors or whatever. Secondly, is to get them to try to perform and get them up out of their seats and doing it. Then maybe they can analyze them.
Right.
Because they've had the experience of hearing them, they have the experience of performing them, and then once they've got that, they should start writing them. They should emulate and create.
Yeah.
And I think those are the four building blocks, and right now most of it, unfortunately, is focused on analysis. And I think that's the hardest to do, and it has the narrowest constituency.
And it does, I think, for students in middle school and high school, has a tendency to turn them off unless it's supervised by a really master teacher.
Yeah. I had a working class mother, but she knew lots and lots of poems by heart. And so she would suddenly say, it was many and many a year ago in that kingdom by the sea that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And that maiden she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. She was a child and I was a child in that kingdom by the sea. And we loved with a love that was more than a love, I and my Annabel Lee. And it's that spell that got me to love poetry.
Yeah, and having your mother recite it to you
have it part of your everyday
spontaneously.
life. Or, she would quote Ogden Nash, when called by a panther, don't answer. And so poetry was just part of our daily life. It was a pleasure, it was an enchantment.
Yeah.
And I think that if we can bring the pleasure and enchantment of poetry into the classroom, we'll have a generation of poetry lovers.
Well, I want to thank you, Dana Gioia. You've been so eloquent on the subject of poetry. Really, makes me want to run home and recite poetry to my kids. But really, it has been...
ask for no higher praise.
It's been a pleasure speaking to you today and having you here.
It's been a pleasure to be here.
Okay, and I want to thank everybody watching for joining us at the Drexel interview today.